Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and I wanted to highlight a fascinating topic that I ran across while scouring the internet: Japanese slavery in the late Middle Ages. I know this is a deviation from my American history content and an even greater deviation from my Civil War content, but I know that the subscribers to this channel are lovers of all things history and wanted to bring this to your attention. When we say the word late Middle Ages, historians are referring to the time period between 1250 and 1500. That time period coincides with the Age of Discovery as European kingdoms began exploring different parts of the world by ship and coming into direct contact to places all over the world, including the Americas, like Christopher Columbus. Europeans also began to explore the Asian coast, and they came into contact with Japan. The Portuguese and the Spanish merchants rapidly converged on Japan, and one of the first trade goods was humans. Some of the first Japanese to set foot in Europe were most likely slaves. By 1555, the Catholic Church began to take notice of and complain about the great number of Portuguese merchants who kept Japanese girls as sex slaves in Europe. King Sebastian of Portugal put forth an edict in the 1570s to stop the trading of slaves with Japan, but that did not stop human trafficking. Jesuit missionaries, a society within the Catholic Church, were the forerunners of missionary work around the world, and Japan was no different. Jesuits set up their Japanese headquarters in Nagasaki and began to proselytize to the Japanese people. They were some of the first to raise the alarm of slavery to the monarchs of Europe and to the Church. King Philip II of Spain and Portugal in 1605 continued his kinfolk's edict against the enslavement of the Japanese, but in his proclamation left it open-ended by putting the blame on the Japanese who were selling the slaves. The Jesuits took the same posture. Their new converts in Japan looked to the Jesuits with criticism because it was the Spanish and Portuguese merchants who were taking part in the slave trade, and it was Spanish and Portuguese Jesuits attempting to convert the Japanese. The Catholic Church in this period exercised incredible power over European kingdoms, and they came out firmly against the Japanese slave trade. Pedro Martins, the Bishop of Japan, had been prepared to sanction the transportation of Japanese outside Japan as long as they were given contracts with a fixed term rather than being treated as slaves. In practice, it had been impossible to maintain the distinction, and Martins had been forced to abandon such sophistry, declaring that anyone involved in the trade would be excommunicated. The Jesuits had now been forced to address the issue of slavery again, as with Pedro Martins' death, his excommunication order had lost its validity. After much discussion, the delegates agreed that it was no longer permissible to transport labor outside Japan, whether as slaves or under contract. King Philip II also confirmed that there were such things as legal and illegal slaves, thus giving a legal standing for many slavers and slave owners. The Jesuits attempted to rectify slavery in their minds. In their view, Japan was a slave-holding and slave-owning society. One major source of slaves, they noted, were captives seized in warfare. According to church doctrine of the time, it was legitimate to treat as slaves prisoners taken in a just war and to soothe their consciences. The Portuguese argued that many of the wars waged by the local warlords against one another were legitimate, making it acceptable to treat as slaves the prisoners taken in them. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, known as the Great Unifier of Japan, had led a military campaign into Korea, and Japanese soldiers and camp followers had carried the practice of seizing captives as slaves to Korea during the invasion of that country at the end of the 16th century. In fact, it was this place that provided the Portuguese with such an abundant supply of slaves for export. The Jesuits held that Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea could not be considered a just war, and thus neither could the enslavement of the prisoners taken in it be condoned. They stated, "If matters are examined closely, then we see from our own experience that the majority of the boys and girls who are sold are kidnapped or tricked and later traded with absolutely no legal title. Insofar as we may assert that there is not one among 100 who has been bought through legal channels, we can well see that great sins emerge from this upon the conscience of those who buy or sell slaves or who consent to this trade. It is very rare and questionable indeed to have legal title to own a slave in Japan, such as might prove that they were made captive in a just war." The general consensus of opinion at a conference of Jesuits seems to have been that the slaves who remained in Japan were better off than those carried abroad. Unlike many of the Portuguese colonies, Japan did not have the kind of economy that required teams of slaves working together. The Portuguese report also indicates that Japanese slaves, unlike their counterparts in the West, owned their own personal possessions and could marry. The Jesuits described in great detail the Japanese slave trade, and it sounds reminiscent of the Middle Passage experienced by Africans to plantations and mines in North and South America. Because the Portuguese make great profits from this trade, they buy up as many slaves as they can without making the required investigation. They treat these slaves like an item of merchandise. Even the Lascars and servants of the Portuguese are buying up slaves and selling them at Macau. As a result, many of these slaves die at sea. This is because they are piled up one body on top of another, there being so many. As soon as their foremen, often the Kaffirs and blacks of the Portuguese, fall ill, the slaves receive succor from no one. Sometimes the masters are unable to give them sufficient provisions. Whereas many have only been taken on as slaves for a limited and agreed period, they end up being sold as slaves for the rest of their lives. The contracts they have concluded limiting the terms of their service are simply broken. Sometimes they are abandoned upon their master's death or once their contracts have come to an end. The men become thieves in Macau, robbing the Chinese who come to the city from the villages with provisions. The women are forced through poverty to live badly and scandalously. Once Japanese slaves left the country, it becomes almost impossible to trace their movements. Both Chinese and Japanese sources, however, confirm the existence of some Japanese slaves at the Portuguese enclave of Macau. The presence of a potential disruptive Japanese community in Macau caused the Chinese great anxiety. The Portuguese were allowed to act as middlemen between China and Japan precisely because the Chinese consider the Japanese to be a major element within the pirate population in East Asia and believed that problem could be reduced by severing all ties with them. They were angered and irritated to discover just how many Japanese slaves the Portuguese had introduced into their settlement. In 1613, the Chinese delivered a series of 5 demands to the Portuguese authorities in Macau, for which a Portuguese translation survives. The first demand concerns the presence of Japanese slaves. You may not retain Japanese people. You are Westerners, and so of what use are Japanese to you when you can use blacks? If things go on like this, the number of Japanese will rise and rise. The law demands that Japanese people should be killed wherever they are found. Your taking in such people is like taking in wild tigers who will eat you too. When I went down to the harbor, I saw many Japanese people, and I immediately had them sent away. The number was over 90. For this reason, I have had a stone pillar set up. As I have driven these people away, you too will be able to live without fear. However, I am afraid that, though I drive them away, you will merely bring more. When you go to that country for trade, you must not bring back any Japanese, be they many or few. Anyone who does bring them will be punished in accordance with the laws of China, which means decapitation. Slavery existed in Japan for some time, so how did one become a slave in this society? One is by birth. One could be born into slavery. However, it was possible for one parent to be enslaved while the other parent was free. In that instance, if it was a boy, it took on the father's status. If it was a girl, it took on the mother's status. Another way to become a slave was through debt, either selling yourself to pay off a debt or selling your child or family member into slavery to pay off a debt. There was also a voluntary enslavement. This would happen commonly with the poor who were faced with starvation or voluntarily being a slave to someone to prevent dying. We also see criminals as slaves. If a criminal was condemned to death but his sentence was commuted, he became the personal property of whoever exercised the policing rights in that area. Medieval law codes also make frequent reference to kidnapping, which in effect meant the taking of slaves. Today, kidnapping for ransom usually implies the seizing of a wealthy individual and the demanding of money. In medieval Japan, wealth meant primarily the ability to control land, and of equal importance, labor. Many of those kidnapped were in fact peasants, and what the kidnapper acquired was access to the labor resources that they represented. When ransoms were demanded, it was after a campaign where people had been seized in bulk and taken to a different domain. Most of the time this happened in war, as discussed earlier. Whenever Hideyoshi pacified a region, one of the first things he did was to order that people who had been carried away as slaves or hostages be returned to their home villages. Such measures served 3 purposes. They announced that the period of civil strife was over and that peace had been restored. They helped tie the workforce to the land and so guaranteed agricultural production, and by forbidding the seizure of each other's labor supply, they helped forestall disputes between the major lords. However, the return of slaves to their rightful homes could be a very difficult task to enforce, and many remained slaves even after such proclamations. It is clear that once possession had been taken of a hostage, he or she could be bought, sold, or bequeathed. The large number of bills of sale surviving from the later medieval period provide evidence that the buying and selling of human beings was common. The rights and limitations of slaves in medieval Japan were diverse and many times depended on each individual. Some could have money, own land and other property, and live a fairly minimally restricted life, but others were allowed no rights by their owners. One unique trade-off in a slave-master relationship was when one gentleman sold himself into slavery for money and agreed for his descendants to also be enslaved to his master's family. Some shoguns of Japan issued edicts prohibiting slave trading. However, this was not to stop slavery. The acquisition and transmission of ownership of a slave by the master might entail financial compensation, but it was illegal for a third party to act as a broker, but this varied on the leader and time period. With the coming of the Portuguese and Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea, the slave traders were able to develop lucrative new markets. These events helped tie Japan into the worldwide trade in slaves developing at that time, the legacy of which has left a huge imprint upon the world to this day. At the same time, within Japan, moves toward the consolidation of authority on the national scale led to renewed efforts to restrict and control trade in human beings. When we learn about the Age of Discovery, our thoughts normally go to the connections between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But let us not forget that Europeans were traveling all over the world, and Asia became a major point of interest for many explorers, sailors, and merchants. Thank you all so much for watching. Please check out the Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages for the channel. Consider joining the Patreon page and subscribe to the channel to get more interesting insights into the world's history.